I mean, I learned a lot. I learned really how sort of biased and corrupt our system of governance is, and how easy it is for corporations and large organisations to essentially spin stuff, to persuade populations that certain things are to their advantage. Yeah, I mean, the Olympic Delivery Authority, how many column inches did they fill on the supposed benefits for the London Olympics? It probably wasn't column inches, it was probably more like column meters, many hundreds of column meters were filled with the supposed benefits, and just about everything they came out with, in my mind, was a distortion at best, lies at worst.
Well, I mean, as far as funds being used correctly, I don't think they were. Um, I don't think the Olympics are a bad thing per se, but because of this corporatisation of it, we had London was completely disrupted for a few weeks, and the amount that's spent on security for, not for athletes, made a mistake. The security was there for a bunch of corporate officials that shouldn't have been there in the first place. So we had a huge bill for that, and we footed that. The taxpayer footed that. So I don't think that's a great use of our money. Certainly not in this economic climate, and not in any economic climate.
The fact that unfortunately, I'm fully aware, of course, that the London Olympics is now proclaimed as being one of the most successful games ever, and there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, all you can do is point out what has happened. I read an article the other day by a journalist in the Telegraph, which repeated a lot of these fictions about, for example, the benefit, the legacy from Stratford City, the athletes' village, all this kind of stuff. I mean, these statements are now trotted out as though they are gospel, and it's very difficult to argue about this. That is one of the problems with these events, and the same thing happens in other countries. It happens in Rio, in Brazil. It'll be happening in Russia with Sochi. Is the same statements are made about the benefits.
When I think about the use of public money in terms of the Olympics, the first thing I think of as a Leyton Orient fan is the money that is going to be loaned by Newham Council to West Ham, somewhere in the region of 30 or 40 million pounds, to help them with their stadium move. And that doesn't seem to me, or quite a lot of reasonable-minded people, to be a fair way of spending public money. It's not a fair distribution of what's available, because it doesn't benefit the community. It benefits one football club over one other, or two others, or many others. So probably that would be my biggest bugbear as a local footballer, or as a fan of Leyton Orient.
The funding for the London Olympics obviously has come out of the public purse. Was it worth the money? Well, I mean, you have to think about what that money could have been spent on instead of the Olympics, and any country or city bidding for an Olympics should consider this. I mean, one estimate for the London Olympics is 24 billion. Even that could be an underestimate. What else could we have spent 24 billion on? I think we could have solved a lot of problems with that money, instead of hosting what to me was just a kind of a bit of circus at best. At worst, it's a massive VIP sleaze fest paid for by the taxpayer. Do I feel vindicated that the London Olympics was not of benefit to the city? Yes, I do feel vindicated. I can't yet see any benefits.
When you look at the London Olympics, the amount that the UK taxpayer funded the organisation by is plenty enough to run an Olympic Games, and that's when you then factor in broadcast money. I think that the corporate sponsors are sort of somewhat superfluous. Now in London, a lot of people, in my view quite correctly, drew attention to the fact that Coca-Cola and McDonald's were sponsors, and how bizarre a situation that is, that that they should be providing all the food on an Olympic Park. But the point there is that they're somewhat questionable on a corporate level, and there's all sorts of issues one can draw, but it's very hard to argue their ineligibility so far as the Olympic Charter is concerned, legally speaking.
Yeah, well, I think the problem is that the Olympics or mega events in general are embedded in the sort of current system of economic and social management. Yeah, that being a sort of neoliberal model. So I can't really see how these mega events can, embed themselves in a society and work for the benefit of most people. I think it's a sort of, it just doesn't work like that.
I think with the nature of sporting events as they stand, it's very difficult to adjust the model to benefit the local population. It's a massive corporation which descends temporarily on one area of a city. And when one looks at the history of any corporation and the cities they exist in long term, you can see the effects and in many cases the damage they've done to their areas. So it's by definition it will damage the local population. It's just a question of whether whether any of that damage is justified or not. But if the model was changed, then of course there would be ways of benefiting the population. It's essentially about a much tighter legacy issue. I think much tighter control of the legacy projects.
I mean, one thing that could be done, but will never be done, is, I think it was 1948 the Olympics came to London. Britain was, post Second World War, very short of money. It was a very sort of toned down Olympics, and it used all the existing venues. I mean, that could obviously be done, but then hang on, the construction companies aren't going to make loads of money. The whole, that's not what it's about. It's about a sort of grand project that involves massive amounts of construction and so forth.
From the organisers' point of view, the lesson they've learned, and was expressed recently in the newspapers by FIFA, I believe, who said that actually it may have been slightly said in jest, but I think this is the truth. They want to get a place with less democracy. There's less protest in Sochi than there is in Rio, despite the fact Sochi's next year and Rio's 2 years after that. There's arguably less democracy in Sochi. And there's certainly less in the history of activism. The lesson is that people should be campaigning at the very, very earliest opportunity. And what that actually means is as soon as their city is announced as a contender to bid for the Olympics, and not once it's announced, half the deals are done.
So I think in terms of a legacy, it really goes back to the very beginning of the bidding process, where you've got to set out a clear strategy, and it's got to be real. It can't be a question of gentrifying an area and then just assuming that people are going to move into it. I think you actually have to really carefully research what your plan is for the legacy of the games, not to build something and then say, oh no, we've got to now find something to fill it. I think that before they even build it, they should have a clear handing over strategy to whoever wants a stadium or a park or whatever it might be.
Don't leave it until your country has won the bid. You have to campaign before the country has won the bid. That is, the really critical time is when your country or your city is thinking about putting in a bid. Or if it's decided to put in a bid, to campaign before it manages to win the bid. The important thing is to campaign the moment you know that your city may be going to go for a bid. Once the city has got a bid, has won its bid, I mean, to be blunt, you're up against it, because you're up against the fact that the city and the national government are both going to plough ahead as hard as they can. So it's very important at that point to build networks and coalitions and argue the case with the media and in public in order to get support, in order to point out that the claims which are made in terms of benefits are mythological. They are fantasies, and the country will not benefit from this event as a whole. The only thing you can do there is to work as hard as you can to point out that this is not going to happen, that what they're saying is a lie. Unfortunately, because by that time the bid has been won and the city's prestige is involved and everything, it's much harder.